So, as you might have noticed, um, the elves are departing from Middle Earth. They are, in their diminished number, passing through to the Grey Havens to be whisked away into the west. The practical effect of this is that soon there will be very few elves remaining, if any. Um, the lords of the West are very persuasive in convincing elves that they need to return to the West before it ceases to be possible to traverse the sea. And it's the Age of Men. So, as far as sort of governance structure goes, not much is going to change because of the departing of the elves. However, it has occurred to me that men derive their sense of history by reading the work of elvish lore masters. This can be misleading. This trust of elvish lore masters. Not because the elvish lore masters lie, but because the elvish lore masters don't write their books to be read by men. Not directly, anyway. I mean, they know men are going to search their libraries and read these works of history, but they're not written for men. Okay. The reason I'm raising that observation is because it occurs to me that if we all leave and you are no longer able by any means to communicate with us, you will be left with your best guess as to what happened in Middle Earth's history. And I say this because when I get around to telling you the real story of Isildur, I will need to have made for myself an apologia of sorts, because when I tell you the truth about Isildur, you will likely either say that I am a liar or that the elvish lore masters were liars. Because they have delivered a story about Isildur. It is a true story. In the elvish sense. Maybe I need to clarify what it means for a story to be true to elves. So take the Silmarillion, for instance. Is the Silmarillion a laying out of events? Is it a book that tells the reader what happened and when? Yes and no. So, for instance, did Tuor pass through the manifold gate of Gondolin? Yes. But that story is not in the Silmarillion because the reader needs to know a fact about something that happened in Middle-earth. That story is in the Silmarillion because it is as if our depiction of Tuor's arrival into the hidden city is more true than it's actually having happened. Our depiction of Tuor's arrival at Gondolin is more real than the actual stepping through the gate. Okay. Something that lore masters noticed when they were trying to convey the history of the war for the Silmarils, something they noticed was that men simply could not be made to understand that the War of the Silmarils was about the Silmarils. Okay. A man will read the Silmarillion and he'll start coming away with all kinds of funny notions about what the war was about. So, learned men who have read the Silmarillion, they will begin to say things like, the war for the Silmarils was an unfolding of Fëanor's hubris. That Fëanor, when he made the diamonds, when he made those Silmarils, it was an act of hubris. And when they were stolen, the natural unfolding of his pride was that the elves would arrive in Middle-earth, and that it's a kind of enduring sin of Fëanor that's playing out in Middle-earth. That is not what the War of the Silmarils was about. The War of the Silmarils was about the Silmarils. Part of why it is so difficult for men to grasp this fundamental fact about the Silmarillion is because with their small hearts and their limited ability to understand, they cannot comprehend the majesty of the Silmaril. You could place a Silmaril in a man's hand, and he still would not understand why the War of the Silmarils was fought. He will still flounder about in confusion, believing all manner of incorrect. It's because he can't look at the Silmaril, and I can't describe it to him either. If I've handed it to him and he can't see it, nothing I'm going to say about it is going to explain it to him. I mean, so I could inform the man. I could inform him that Fëanor was the greatest craftsman of all time, and skill in general, skill at all, reached its unparalleled zenith when Fëanor constructed the Silmarils. But man's understanding of skill is limited to what? Martial prowess. They sometimes build houses. I suppose they weave clothing. But they don't live long enough for their notion of skill to guide them into an understanding of the Silmarils. Because when I say that Fëanor exhibited the zenith of skill in the creation of those things, what they're thinking in their heads is, so he was like the basket weaver who lives next door, except better. Right? That framing of what a Silmaril is just, it cannot get through to a man. I could say that the Silmaril is the most beautiful thing in all of existence. I could place the Silmaril in the man's hand, point at it, and say, "You cannot possibly encounter something more beautiful than this is." But their eyes are too dim to see the Silmaril as the most beautiful object. Okay. So what is the point I'm making here? The point I'm making here is that the Silmarillion was a story that we wrote for ourselves. And you might say that it's more true than the events it depicts, because when we read it, our understanding of those events is illuminated by it. There is a downside to making the Silmarillion in this way. And that downside is, at least from a man's perspective, that downside is that what we needed to present to ourselves, to tell a story about the unfolding of events in Middle-earth, doesn't have the kind of one-to-one relation with history that men in their literature typically expect. So, as an example, the men of Numenor, their peak literary device was the annals. This was their art form in literature, in lore making. And the annals are simply a name of years, the names of kings, and a collection of actions that the kings undertook while they were on Numenor. And if you go back, if you could somehow watch the events unfold, what you would see is that indeed these names, these people did these things in these years. It's not really how elves think about history, right? So I guess I should get to the reason that I needed this apologia for the Elvish lore masters. The story of Isildur is a particularly devious example of Elvish lore writing being misleading to men. It's not misleading to elves, because we were there, we've been around since the beginning of time, and we remember everything. So we don't need to be told the details, right? What we need is a nice story. And if we end up dilating moments to expand them in our understanding, if we take a moment and spread it out, okay, then we might take other moments and condense them together. Well, to get to the point, Isildur was king of Mordor and Gondor for 10,000 years. Okay, so that's a bit to process for you. What you're probably thinking or asking yourself here is, but the story says that Sauron was in Mordor. That was true. Historically, that was the case. Men and elves came to find Sauron intolerable. That was also true. They formed a last alliance, a military endeavor to encircle Mordor. That happened. They invaded Mordor and put his armies to the sword, and they overwhelmed Sauron. And that's all true. True enough. And then you would say, and then the story says Isildur cut the ring off of Sauron's hand. And that's true. And he put on the ring. And now you're thinking the story says the last alliance killed Sauron after taking the ring off of his hand. That is also true, but you see, in your reckoning, there was a span of time between the removal of the ring from Sauron's hand and the historical moment where Sauron actually died, and that span of time was 10,000 years. To elves, this is not, much time. Something elves have a hard time conveying to men, much like how we cannot convey to you the Silmarils. We have a hard time conveying just how long we have been around. The Silmarillion, it jumps in time based on when events happen. And when you read them in sequential order, you get the sense that they happen temporally close to each other, but they don't. The events of the Silmarillion take place over a period of time that is unimaginable to the minds of men. So 10,000 years of Isildur's reign for us is basically just one event. The cutting off of the ring and the slaying of Sauron for us might as well have happened in the same day. But you men, your view of your history is going to be distorted by that elvish bias if someone does not tell you the explicit an accounting of the explicit sequence of events. Okay. So what did Isildur do during those 10,000 years of his reign? Mostly we don't care. The elves, I spent most of that time just sort of, being in the woods. And it never became important to us because Isildur's reign was so inwardly focused, right? It never became a problem for us that he had the ring. What Isildur established, just try to set it out plainly, and by the end of this story you'll maybe understand the discretion of the elves in not reminding men that this happened. Isildur captured Sauron. The last battle had just occurred. He was surrounded by his honor guard. He had just cut the ring from Sauron's hand, and his honor guard raised their spears to the neck of Sauron. Isildur put on the ring, and then he said, "Sauron must not die." And immediately his honor guard stamped the butts of their spears into the ground, and they did not kill Sauron. Why did Isildur choose not to kill Sauron? Well, Isildur, he was already fairly long-lived at this point, and he was also of the lineage of kings. So he was very informed about the events as they had unfolded from the perspective of the kingdom of Numenor. And so he was aware that when Sauron is removed from his body, he returns in another form. And so Isildur had the reasonable idea that one way to prevent the re-emergence of Sauron into the world would be to imprison him in his body. And then Isildur, the new Lord of the Ring, would at all times know where his enemy was. Right? As opposed to what ultimately ends up happening, which is that Sauron does get killed at the end of Isildur's reign, and as you observed, he did indeed return. So Isildur wanted to delay the recurrence of Sauron. The way in which he did this is what is going to be interesting to your... it's what you're going to need to know in order to understand your own history before we leave. So, what Isildur did... what the new Lord of the Ring did is he chained Sauron into the middle of a field. Arms at length, chains on wrists, chains on his neck and his legs. And he set a guard around him. He was part of the guard at first. Isildur kept watch. And he had the standing order that if anyone should make an attempt to slay Sauron, they will be put to death. Isildur eventually decides that he can't, as king, he can't just stay there all the time, keeping an eye on Sauron, or more importantly, maybe keeping an eye on the guards that he had set around Sauron. And so, what Isildur needed to do was design a kind of prison around Sauron. You see, he needed the men who worked in shifts to ensure that no other men killed Sauron. He needed to ensure that those men would not themselves kill Sauron. If you see what I'm saying. So what he does is this field. It's behind the mountains of Mordor. He constructs guard towers that face inward. You've perhaps seen them, or you've maybe seen drawings of them or told stories of them. In the last war, you may have passed by them in order to enter into Mordor. You might have thought it strange that Mordor's first line of defense is towers that are hardened to the inside and not the outside. The reason for this is that they were designed to serve as a locus of control over what happened in the courtyard surrounding Sauron. Okay. So, Isildur, the towers come a little bit later in the story. What Isildur notices is that there is this kind of madness that breaks out in the guards that he places around Sauron. He notes that if a guard is around Sauron long enough, he will eventually try to kill Sauron, which is obviously unacceptable to Isildur for reasons that we have earlier established. So he needs to devise ever more stringent methods of control over the guards he has set. Ultimately, this involves the construction of the two towers that face into the courtyard. The madness that broke out inside the courtyard, what it was, the form it took was that groups of men would join together in a plan, right? This was the problem as Isildur saw it. Men would form plans to kill Sauron. And when they executed their plan, either the structure that he designed into his prison would stop this attempt, or Isildur himself would have to arrive and stop the attempt. This happened many times, and the explicit meaning when I say that Isildur would have to stop these attempts to kill Sauron, it is Isildur arriving back into Mordor with the ring and with his honor guard. And it is him clearing the courtyard. When the rings are given to bearers, the rings sort of amplify their natural abilities, you might say. The rings make the ring bearers better at whatever it is that they were already skilled at doing. Isildur was a king, and he was very good at being a king. And he was also a military, I don't know, I don't want to call him a strategist. He was a fighter of war. So when I say Isildur periodically had to clear the courtyard using the ring, what I mean is that Isildur and his honor guard would identify the members of the insurrection and put them to the sword. And if he could not identify or distinguish between members of the insurrection and those who were not, then he would put the whole system to the sword. Everyone in the courtyard, everyone in the towers. And he could do this because himself, surrounded by his honor guard, with his ruined Númenorian sword, were completely unstoppable. They could not be defeated in battle. So, Isildur has constructed this prison. And he has constructed this system to perpetuate the prison. We have some primary sources. We have some primary sources to which the men of Gondor are not privy, because the men of Gondor do not interact in any way with the men of the East and the South. We have some primary sources from some of these insurrection attempts. They tell us that one of the decisions by Isildur, one of the new sort of framing of his society, one of the new cultural rituals that he tried, was that he said this plain, this courtyard, this body of Sauron in chains and immobile, it is our Meneltarma. It is our monument, our altar of worship to Eru, to God. Our maintenance of this courtyard, our maintenance of this structure, is how we worship Eru. And so he called upon the tradition of Meneltarma, that none who are at its peak may speak, except for the king. Did Isildur believe that this was... Did Isildur truly believe that his imprisonment of Sauron was a burnt offering to God? I don't know. But the practical effect of establishing this rule was that it was exceptionally difficult to formulate a plan in practice that would bring about the death of Sauron. Because if you began to speak to another person who worked in the courtyard to maintain this prison, you would be put to death. As was similarly the punishment for speaking at the top of Meneltarma if you were not the king. I mean, notably, that rule never became relevant because back in the day, the men still held the kind of reverence for Eru that would naturally that would lead them to respect that high peak with silence, even if it were not commanded of them. Similarly, the fear of the consequences of violating the sanctity of the courtyard, the fear of that consequence also inspired in men a silence. But that is just one episode. One episode in the long span of Isildur's reign. He lived for 10,000 years, and the system that he established within the courtyard, it expanded, you might say, in kind of concentric circles out of Mordor, where more and more of Gondorian society came to be devoted to the maintenance of this prison. Where more and more of the designs of men were bent around the maintenance of the system. So the kind of control that Isildur established within that courtyard to keep Sauron in chains, that system expanded into a system of control that Isildur had over Gondor, over all of the men of the West. So he had a long time in which to try different ideas for how to maintain, how to keep Sauron in those chains. One of them was naming the courtyard Meneltarma. It didn't seem to work out very well. There's a practical difficulty, especially as the sort of bureaucracy of this prison expanded. There's a practical difficulty if people simply are unable to speak. Messages can't be delivered. And then people become unsure, like, how far out of Mordor do I have to be before I can speak? It introduced all kinds of logistical and administrative difficulties to have this blanket ban on speaking in the courtyard. So he didn't keep that going for all that long. But it's just an example of the kind of just an example of one of the methods that Isildur developed for keeping his grip on Mordor. So, a natural follow-up question, now that this truth has been revealed to you, aside from asking me to detail the particulars of Isildur's 10,000-year reign, which would take a long time, and honestly, I don't have most of the details. It was part of the sort of understood agreement between the kingdoms of the elves and Isildur that, well, the ring has to persist in order for the elven rings to persist. So long as Isildur was occupied over there in the mountains, keeping watch over Sauron, it was sort of a stable equilibrium, you might say. It introduced into the world a kind of cessation of events that would serve as sort of signposts to the changing of history. So the Elven kingdoms were I don't know if you'd say happy, but they weren't dissatisfied with this state of affairs. So it wasn't the elves who killed Isildur, or well, okay. So what happened to Isildur? Well, as we just discussed, Isildur had frequently to enter into the courtyard and wield the ring. I guess we don't have to be squeamish. Frequently, he had to massacre the membership, or he had to purge the administrative system of the prison he had constructed. He had to enter the courtyard with his honor guard and, put everyone down. On the last occasion where he tried to do this, he found that more of the people in the courtyard were against him than anticipated. It is true that Isildur was the Lord of the Ring, and he did have his honor guard with him, but even then Isildur was not a Lord of the West, So he and his honor guard retreated to the towers. It was part of the point of the towers, is that all you really need to do is ensure that the gate operators at the tower are still loyal to Isildur, and then worst case scenario, the ring, Isildur can escape and retain the ring and return later if necessary. But he escapes to the gates of the towers. He tries to escape into the towers, and he finds that the gate operators actually are not loyal to him any longer. And also the people he set in the tower to keep eyes on the gate operators were also traitors. So they were attempting in real time, historically, they were attempting in real time to put a stop to Isildur's protection of Sauron. But Isildur was the Lord of the Ring. And as he tried to flee Mordor, everyone in his path, you might say, was red. Everyone in his path were his enemies because they were preventing him from escaping. So, Isildur and his honor guard cut a path through Gondor, and they fled, because they found that wherever they went, the conspiracy to put Sauron to death was chasing them. It finally reached a kind of tipping point in his kingdom where it would be tolerated no longer that Sauron was permitted to live. So Isildur is fleeing west with his honor guard. It is still notably the most formidable military force in all of Middle-earth, because it is being led by the Lord of the Ring. So, I mean, the story you've been given by the Elvish lore masters, and a story that was echoed by Gandalf, is that Isildur, the peak of humanity, the greatest of all men, who possessed the One Ring. The story tells you is what the story tells you is that he and his honor guard were accosted by a scouting party of orcs. And his honor guard were cut down, and Isildur fled, and the ring slipped from his finger. The Lord of the Ring, whether it's Isildur or if it had been a hobbit with that honor guard, does not lose a battle against a scouting party of orcs. The Lord of the Ring with his honor guard does not lose a battle against every orc on an open field. So, I mean, at some point, honestly, okay, if you're not aware of the power of the ring, if you're not aware of what Isildur constructed in Mordor, then I suppose you'd have no reference point for considering the plausibility of the story that you've been given. If you never had watched Isildur clear the courtyard, you would not see how laughably implausible the story you have been given is. But what actually did happen? Well, it became apparent to the men of Gondor and anybody joining in on their conspiracy that it was not going to be possible to slay Isildur. The chase at some point had to cease. But okay, they chased Isildur and his honor guard, inflicting as much violence as they could scrape together against them. And indeed, Isildur was compelled at some point to take to the river, and the ring slipped off his finger. It's the funniest, from our perspective, it's the funniest event in all of the history of Middle-earth. Isildur swimming in the river, and what he had forgotten is that rings slip off of fingers sometimes, and it slipped off his finger. Well, okay, so the ring is now in a marsh. It's in like this bog, right? And the most important objective in all the world for Isildur and his elite honor guard is to find the ring. So they set up a camp, and they dredged that bog for years, and they did not find the ring. And given how driven they were to find the ring, I think it's safe to say that by that point it in fact was no longer in the bog. So what Isildur and his honor guard began to do is they began to study the sort of geography, or I don't know, the geology of the waterways that connected to that bog. because they had to discern where the ring could have gotten off to. I mean, okay, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The first objective actually was not to clear the bog. The first objective was to make it so that there was nobody in range of the ring who was not Isildur and his honor guard. So in practice, what happened when Isildur dropped the ring was a massacre of everyone near that bog. Right, because what Isildur could not allow was that somebody else found the ring before he did. And the practicable way of solving that problem is making it so that no one is alive who can find it except for himself and his honor guard. Okay, so Isildur established a perimeter. He began surveying the land and studying the waters. I'm going to take a quick break, get back and continue this little historical analysis. Alright. So, Isildur and his honor guard are tracing out the waterways that connect to this bog where the ring was lost. What they found was that there was a tributary that extended from this bog and passed into the mountains. And I suppose the dwarves are never going to tell you this story. The dwarves, as I understand it, are not on history-sharing terms with men. They've never really told us anything about themselves either. They just keep to themselves. So they're probably not going to tell you this story, and it's an event in Middle Earth that should shape your understanding of yourselves. So this is why I am going to tell you. They found that there was a tributary that extended from the bog and through underground waterways passed through into Khazad-dûm. And so Isildur called up his honor guard, and they marched on Khazad-dûm. They pounded on the door, and the door was opened. And Isildur said to the dwarves, "One of you has the ring. I will have the ring." The dwarves insisted that they did not have it. So Isildur entered into Khazad-dûm with his honor guard and began to search for it. Which naturally, the dwarves did not appreciate this incursion into one of the centers of their civilization, and they fought back. And they lost because Isildur has been training for war for 10,000 years. Isildur searched every room of Khazad-dûm, and he killed you've seen Khazad-dûm. The story that gets told about Khazad-dûm is that the dwarves delved too deeply in their pursuit of Mithril, and by doing this they unleashed an ancient remnant of Morgoth's army or something. And, the story is true to us. That is what happened. That is the best story behind it. It illuminates most clearly why what happened. In what sense, you might be asking, because it is difficult to understand. Well, the plausibility that the dwarves had the ring was increased to the extent of the size of Khazad-dûm. What do I mean? I mean that Khazad-dûm is enormous in its sprawling occupation of the mountain. You may clear out Khazad-dûm one day, and therefore obtain the opportunity to witness for yourself the magnitude of that dwarven mansion in the mountain. But suffice it to say, if you arrive at Khazad-dûm and you think that somewhere in that mountain there might be the ring, you are going to be searching for a very long time. If, for instance, if instead Isildur had reached the conclusion that the ring was in Rivendell, it would not have taken very long to search Rivendell for the ring, and the violence probably would not have been necessary. They could have found the one elf who happened to have it or didn't, and just take it from that one, you know? Because Rivendell is basically just, I mean, it's a city, but it's not, you know, that big. But Khazad-dûm is very large, and it housed many dwarves. And so it was imminently plausible that in the next chamber, in the next room, in the next floor, you would find the ring. And as the dwarves fought back, it became more plausible to Isildur that they had the ring. Part of this, I guess, is because Isildur's martial capacity was diminished by no longer possessing the ring. And so for the first time in a long time, putting aside his recent troubles in Mordor, for the first time in a long time, Isildur was finding it difficult to win battles. And a natural conclusion to reach is that the reason it is difficult to win these battles is because your enemy has the ring. Now, you might say to me, we know what happened in Khazad-dûm. We can see the aftermath of it. It's not men who are holed up in Khazad-dûm. It's goblins. Goblins seized Khazad-dûm with the assistance of a Balrog. Well, Isildur did not find the ring. He left Khazad-dûm, and he continued with the task of tracing out the waterways. What he found was that there was a limited number of possible avenues through which the ring could pass. The other avenues, one could pass out to the sea. So he posted guards on the outlet of the waterways that passed into the sea. What he was very concerned about, though, was a waterway that led into another mountain. Because what he found was that under that mountain there was a continuation of a waterway that appeared to pass into the abyss. What do I mean? Oh, under that storied mountain where Bilbo finds the ring, there is a pool of water. And in that pool of water there is a whirlpool that goes into untold depths, where if the ring entered into that whirlpool, it would never be found again. So Isildur, strategic thinker as he is, realizes that if the ring were to pass through this waterway, it would pass beyond his grasp forever. And so this needed to be the primary location to post guards, to find the ring. So Isildur kept watch over this pool, and he established a fortification in the mountain. Notably, when the god of war holes up in a mountain, a collection of mountain tunnels that he is expanding by the day, with his hand-picked honor guard, one does not take that mountain. One does not enter the tunnels in combat with Isildur, which was Isildur's aim. He needed to make it so that no one else could gain control over the ultimate end point of the ring, right? Because the ring is going to pass into that whirlpool at some point. Isildur doesn't know how long that is going to take, but either it is going to arrive there of its own accord, going to arrive there because of the natural flow of the water that he had mapped out, or it was going to arrive there because someone was going to try to destroy it, or at least remove it beyond his grasp. Or, if it never arrived there, then it was never going to be the case that it passed beyond his grasp, because that was the only way it could do so. So Isildur kept guard over this pool of water. And eventually he did find the ring. The ring did arrive in this pool of water as long anticipated. But it has been, at this point in history, a long time since Isildur first set out for Mordor. And the person that you would try to call Isildur at this point was, shall we say, adapted to subterranean life. He was well positioned to be a guard of an underground pool in a mountain. So, to lay the card on the table, the point being made here is that Smeagol is Isildur. Much diminished from his initial stature. Now you might say, what truth is there in the Elvish lore masters recounting that Smeagol was, that Smeagol was a small and petty creature who became ensnared by the ring? But when you see it from our perspective, for one thing, when you see it from our perspective, you are not confused. Smeagol is just another name we have for Isildur, at a different phase in his life. After events actually happened that necessitated us to name the unfolding of history. So we are not confused by the story that we told ourselves, notably. We didn't write these stories for you. We wrote them for ourselves, and if you happen to be confused by them, if you happen to reach what you think are erroneous conclusions about things that have happened, it's not our concern, because we didn't write the stories for you. Okay, but what truth is there in saying that the ring was found by a small and petty creature? Well, look at him. Look at the mightiest king of men. Well, and Isildur ultimately destroyed the ring, as he should have done initially. Destiny was fulfilled. I was saying earlier that the reason we depicted Tuor passing through the gates to Gondolin was because our depiction of it was more real than the event itself. It just happens to be the case that our depiction coincides with what you would think of as an actual historical event. The reason that you need to know about Isildur's reign is because Isildur with the ring was in every breath the passing of Tuor through the gates. Isildur, when he had the ring, was with every breath Beren grasping the Silmaril off the brow of Morgoth. He was Turin slaying the dragon with his every step. To erase Isildur's reign from history, as you might judge the lore masters as having done, is to deprive men of this most true image. But you can see, I think, the mercy in our to watch Isildur become Smeagol, to become this small creature, is, we're afraid it might be unbearable for you. We believed it would be intolerable for you to know that a man could be like Isildur. Because notably the story that I have now, the history I have now informed you of, is very it's filled with gaps, right? Because I haven't actually told you much about the organization of Gondor. I haven't really told you all that much about the actions of Isildur, except for a few particularly important actions. So you don't really, you've not been given much of a view of what it was like, say, to be a Gondorian under Isildur. So I will probably need to tell you more about the reign of Isildur so that you can understand yourselves more fully. But I'll have to do that another